Hello and welcome again to Tales of the Wild, the podcast which explores the science of animal biology through stories. I think you're going to like this one. This time we're looking into the lives of giant beasts from the north. This tale is about survival in the extreme cold, coping in a landscape of vicious predators, a selfish betrayal. Welcome to Tales of the Wild. Jagged edges of grey rock emerge out of a white haze of twisting and spiralling snow caught in the endless and sporadic winds of the Arctic tundra. The landscape is a desolate place, with the constant white noise of snow brushing against surfaces of ice and rock in the blizzard. A dark, stoic figure, shifting in and out of visibility in the passing storm, stands still and tall like a Viking in the blizzard, on top of a small hill, looking out across the cracked icy tundra. He is a muskox. He does not seem to notice the constant bombardment of horizontal snow. He shakes his massive body, sending a cloud of snow and loose clumps of raggedy matted hair off into the wind. His thick, leathery skin hangs loosely over a body of muscle and fat, and on it he wears a dense rug of long, scruffy hair, which hangs down to his toes. The dark hair, covered in patches of snow and ice, obscure almost everything except his expressionless face, which is crowned with a battering ram of horn, ending in large upward-turned spikes to each side of the head. He releases a long, low-pitched groan, and two plumes of warm vapor shoot out of his nostrils, as if forced reluctantly into the freezing air by a pair of ancient, powerful bellows. He was a proud-looking beast, and holds his head up high as the wind blows wildly into his long hair. He casts his eyes over the landscape around him, occasionally looking back to check on his family. It is the middle of winter, and they sought out higher grounds to avoid the deep snow, which makes foraging for food here almost impossible. This was a good spot, if there were one. There were plenty of rock outcrops here which had risen above the snow, allowing lichens to grow in abundance. He looked at the lichens with distaste. Lichens are neither plants nor animals, but a symbiotic combination of fungi and cyanobacteria. The fungi produces threads called hyphae, which trap moisture and nutrients from the environment, and the cyanobacteria convert sunlight into carbohydrates. They are not a tasty meal for the Muskoxen, but they are certainly better than nothing, and there is very little grass available at this time of year on account of the heavy snowfall and short day lengths. He watched as another member of his group moved towards the rocky surface covered in lichens which he had his eye on. The male, though slightly smaller than he, was a very stocky and impressive-looking animal nonetheless. It had an unusual light patch of fur above its left eye. Our bull walked slowly towards the male and then began to accelerate into a march with intent, giving out a low grunt. The other male quickly backed off and moved to one of the less lichen-rich rocks to feed, looking over his shoulder occasionally to see if he was still being pursued. He was not, and he relaxed and began to feed with a few other individuals. Our muskox cared deeply for the rest of the herd, and in many ways he needed them, but he was the dominant bull, and he could not tolerate subordinates taking liberties. This was going to be his rock for the next few days. He arrived at the rock and rubbed his face against its hard surface to mark his territory, secreting a scented fluid from a preorbital gland near his left eye. This secretion contained a message with words to the effect of,
"If this rock comes into your sight, you better run or be ready to fight."
The subtle chemical constituents of this secretion gave clues as to his ranking, size, and health status. It was very unlikely that his claim on this rock would be challenged. This ownership of precious resources, particularly when resources are limited, would keep him as the largest and strongest member of his herd and protect his status as the dominant male. This group lived in a herd of 12 members. There were 3 calves that had been born 2 months earlier, 5 cows, 3 subordinate bulls, and our dominant bull. How warm-blooded mammals like this survive in these kind of temperatures is nothing short of extraordinary. Muskoxen have a two-layered coat to help to keep them warm in these extreme conditions. There is an outer layer of coarse long hairs called guard hairs and an undercoat made from very fine fibers called civet. Civet is stronger and warmer than sheep's wool and softer than cashmere, but it's also very expensive. It usually reaches prices of over $3,000 per kilogram. In addition to this double-layered coat, the muskoxen weigh up to 400 kilograms. They have very large body masses. This may not sound so large compared to other species of cattle, except that muskoxen, despite the name, are not actually cattle. There is not a drop of bovine blood in the bodies of these beasts, which are actually more closely related to goats, though in a genus of their own called ovibos. They are, however, like both cattle and goats, ungulates. Ungulates, broadly speaking, are hoofed mammals. There are two categories of ungulate, even-toed and odd-toed. Even-toed ungulates such as sheep, goats, cows, giraffes, deer, pigs, and our muskoxen here, bear their weight on just 2 toes. The other toes, if still present, do not support the weight of the animal. So in addition to having feet which carry their whole weight on just 2 toes, even-toed ungulates also digest cellulose, one of the very difficult to digest components of grass, using 1 or more stomachs. Odd-toed ungulates, which includes only horses, rhinos and tapirs, can also digest cellulose, but do so using their intestines, and also carry their weight on just 1 toe. So if you look at a horse's hoof, it might look like one large foot, but you're actually looking mainly at just a fingernail, and it's the middle fingernail which they support their weight on. Just to complicate things a little further, as we like to do in zoology, whales and dolphins also fall into the category of even-toed ungulates, despite the fact they do not digest cellulose and they don't support any weight on their toes at all. This is because their ancestors were even-toed ungulates. The closest living relatives of cetaceans, that's whales and dolphins, are in fact hippos. So the muskox is neither a cow nor a goat, but it is an even-toed ungulate, and it uses its large size to reduce heat loss, because larger animals tend to retain heat more efficiently because of their high body mass to surface area ratio, which minimizes heat loss through convection, which is particularly important in this cold, windy climate. This is also why so many of the largest of their kind are found in colder climates. For example, there's the gerfalcon, the largest falcon species, the polar bear, the largest bear species, the Arctic wolf is the largest wolf. We can also see this within the same species, such as red foxes, where the southern populations are smaller than the northern populations. This phenomenon is known as Bergmann's rule. Broadly speaking, the colder the environment, the larger the animals. And there's another rule known as Allen's rule, which states that species in colder climates should have shorter limbs and other extremities in general. This makes sense, again, to reduce surface area and potential heat loss by convection and radiation. It can be seen, for example, in polar bears, which have very short, flattened ears compared to their southern relatives, and indeed muskoxen, which have proportionally short legs. It's also seen in our species. If you take a look at Inuits, who live in these cold climates, they have proportionally shorter limbs than average for our species. So Bergmann's rule, colder climates lead to larger bodies. Allen's rule, colder climates lead to shorter features such as limbs. And my rule, let's stop talking about rules so much and get back to the story. As the muskoxen grew weary of scratching the dry, bitter lichens off the rocks with their teeth, the sun itself seemed to grow weary along with them, retiring after just a few hours of an unproductive day. Its penetrative glare seemed to have little influence over this environment, and as it withdrew, the icy fingers of night came creeping over the land, along with a biting wind. The tired muskoxen, in a behavioral adaptation to the cold, huddled close together to share each other's body warmth, with the adults taking turns to withstand the colder peripheries of the group and keep guard. The night was silent apart from the screeching wind and the occasional dreamy grunt from members of the sleeping herd. Later into the night, the screeching wind whispered a terrifying word quietly into our dominant male's ear. Wolves. It came in the form of a very distant howl. The message was clear, and it sent chills down his spine. It was the first time he had felt the cold that day. They would not arrive here tonight, but they were not far away. They would have to be extra vigilant over the next few days. During this kind of weather, and with young calves about, they could not take any chances. You might think that wolves suffer in this weather because of a lack of food. Actually, they relish the bad weather and the bodies it leaves behind. Although polar bears and grizzlies will on rare occasions attack muskoxen, Arctic wolves do regularly hunt them, and particularly the young calves. As a consequence, muskoxen have a very strong instinctive fear of wolves. When they awoke the next day, there was a general feeling of unease in the herd. It seems as though the dominant male was not the only one to hear the distant howls of the wolves. The mothers of the calves kept them closer than usual as they foraged around for good patches of lichens on rocks. The dominant female of the herd made the decision to move on from the area, away from the howls of the wolves, and they all agreed. They began trudging through the snow to the other side of the hills. They continued their journey for a week and did not hear any more howls in the nights and slept much better. They were rather hungry as these foraging grounds were not so plentiful. The dominant male had to be a little bit more aggressive in deterring the subordinates from good feeding grounds. He saw the best rock in the area, and after making a bluff charge towards one of the subordinates, he stopped to mark the territory, again using his preorbital gland. As he smelt the rock, he realized he was not the first here. There was a faded message.
He who is here, who is not I, had better run, or will here die.
He looked up and saw a large, ferocious-looking, unfamiliar lone bull charging at him down the hill. He held his ground. If food resources were less scarce, he may have run away from this encounter. There was no sense in risking injury when being tailed by wolves. The bull stopped shortly before him upon seeing that he was not fleeing. This other bull was old and mean-looking. The tip of his left horn had broken off. He looked like he'd been cast out from another herd by younger males, and he was out here trying to survive. He looked very battle-worn and desperate, and our dominant bull almost felt sorry for him. This was not a significant challenge, but still, he had to maintain his position in the herd and remove this outsider. He began a very typical type of fight between two male muskoxen. He bowed his head, and the old mean bull copied the motion. They then paced backwards with slow, deliberate steps, swaying in an exaggerated motion left and right as they did so, while breathing out hot clouds of air. The rest of the herd watched the two from a safe distance, keeping the calves close by. The two fighting bulls continued to pace backwards until they were about 20 meters apart. Then they tore forwards in a rapid dash with all of their speed. They did not slow down as they approached the collision. If anything, they put even more energy into it, and they collided together with such intensity that a loud crack echoed around the hills. There was no recoil from either beast. The two stopped with their heads touching for a few seconds, and then they began to pace backwards once more, again swaying their heads left and right as they did so. The sharp tips of the horns are not used in encounters like this. It's the hard mass of rounded horn that sits squarely above the faces, like a battering ram. Again, once they approached a distance of about 20 meters apart, they ripped forwards, sending clouds of snow as they ran at full speed. And then with all their strength they smashed their heads together with bone-jarring ferocity, like a collision between two very heavy trains, each travelling at around 60 kilometers per hour. This kind of impact would cause immediate death in most species, but the muskox has a special adaptation for this purpose. It has a bony plate of skull right behind the horns, and in addition a pocket of air that sits right in front of the brain and acts as a cushion during the impact, preventing the brain from bashing against the wall of the skull to the extent that it rarely, if ever, suffers from concussions during these battles. Once again, the muskoxen lined up, ready to charge at each other. This time the older male stopped before it had reached its backward distance, and it began to look to the side with a non-threatening posture. It was beginning to relax when it noticed that our dominant male was charging towards it. It was too late now to square up with the head, and he could not risk being hit in any other part of the body, so the newcomer ran to the side, narrowly dodging the full impact of the attack, and then walked briskly to the far end of the herd, humiliated. Our muskox was the victor. He walked slowly back to mark his territory over the marking of the previous male.
Come back here, if you dare. I'll crush you again, of this I swear.
Being a gracious leader, and with the presence of the distant wolves in mind, he decided not to chase off this old male completely. There was safety in numbers, and they would benefit from a larger herd. The old bull began to slowly ingratiate himself with the other members of the herd. They grunted at him with reluctant acceptance and a hint of mistrust. The females would not look at him, unimpressed with his efforts to overthrow their leader. Every time he approached a lichen-covered rock, he was chased off. He was now the lowest-ranking member, and fed from the worst foraging spots. He was not happy with losing the battle, but he was clearly content to have company out here. Part of him knew that he would not have survived long enough alone to compete against the wolves that he'd also heard the previous week. They had a habit of picking on the weak and the old, but with these 3 calves around, he knew he would no longer be the easiest pick of meat for those ghostly canids. He smiled to himself as he foraged amongst the herd, sneaking glances at the females of the herd and frequently glancing cautiously at the dominant male. His eyes narrowed as he looked at him. He hated that animal and how it had taken his rock and humiliated him in front of the females. He would have the last laugh. It was another cold night a few days later, and they heard the wolves once again, this time much closer. Few of them could sleep that night, and most of the adults were standing guard. They knew the wolves had no chance while they were together as a large herd. It was not until the sun was up that they got their first glance of the wolves. They saw them as 4 white dots zigzagging their way towards them from the horizon, occasionally pausing to rest, but only for a few minutes. It was impossible to hide from wolves out here. The terrain was too open, and the wolves had an incredible sense of smell. The wolves had surely been following them because of the calves. About an hour later, the wolves were approaching, and the adults' instincts kicked in. All of them formed a tight circle around the youngsters with their horns facing outwards. They moved like 4 ghosts in the snow, seeming to barely notice the ring of muskoxen that they moved towards. You could tell that they had not fed in a few days. Their coats were a pristine white, which you would not see if they'd just consumed a meal. One of them sat down about 40 meters away from the herd, and another one went to sleep nearby. They seemed in no hurry to conduct an attack. This was typical of the wolves. They knew that time was on their side, and that the muskoxen would have to let their guard down at some point to feed. One more wolf started to sleep, and another lazily began to ring around the herd, still at a safe distance. The circling wolf's eyes lost some of their apparent indifference when they came to rest on one of the calves. They were replaced by a wild intensity with murderous intent. The calf pressed up hard against its mother, who let out a nervous grunt as she watched the wolf. The wolf then returned to its casual stroll around the herd and rejoined its pack. Our dominant muskox knew the danger. They had already lost a calf to wolves this year, and he was not prepared to let it happen again. Several hours passed without much changing. One of the subordinate males in the muskox group lost his patience and made a charge towards the wolves. They scattered, making excited yips as they went. As he chased one of the wolves, the other wolves closed in on the gap in the circle, but the gap was quickly filled by large hairy masses with pointy horns, and the wolves retreated, instead chasing the subordinate male muskox, who after a few threatening postures towards them lost his confidence and ran back to join the herd. The herd had slowly started to move away from the wolves. At first it was just a few strides backwards, but then they turned and ran. The wolves' predatory instincts fired up and they gave chase. Occasionally one of the muskoxen would turn around and threaten the wolves, stomping the ground and lowering their heads. This stopped the wolves in their tracks, who waited for the threatening muskox to turn and flee again before continuing their chase. This pattern happened time and time again, except this time one of the wolves made a break for it and ran past the threatening bull directly towards the center of the herd. He dodged a few horns and approached a calf, but was almost struck by the horn of its protective mother, and he ran outside the herd again. However, as the mother gave chase, one of the other wolves took advantage of the situation, and from the other side closed in on the calf. The calf was terrified, but knew he had a big male bull next to him and that he was relatively safe. Only he was not. It was the mean old bull that had recently joined the herd. The calf let out a cry of surprise and fear as that mean old male muskox accelerated away towards the front of the herd, leaving a massive gap in their defenses. The wolf took advantage of this and snapped at the heels of the young calf briefly before the mother returned and caught him with a glancing headbutt. He went flying to the side and rolled across the snow, where he was left behind in a daze. As he started to get up, he narrowly dodged a second attack, this time by the dominant male of the herd, who ran back towards the herd to protect the calves. There were still 3 wolves closing in on them. Every time a muskox attacked one of the wolves, it created a point of entry for other wolves. They approached the peak of one of the hills. Up here they would have the advantage. The wolves seemed to know that they were losing this battle and began slowing down in their pursuit. As the dominant male rejoined the herd, he turned and looked at the wolves. They were now quite a distance away and had stopped chasing. The 4th wolf, which had been hit by the mother, joined them and was limping slightly. The wolves had clearly decided it was too dangerous to go after the calves when there were so many adults present. Our dominant male was triumphant and relieved. He turned back to check on the herd when he was greeted with an almighty crash and fell to the floor. He struggled to get back to his feet. The wolves were watching him from a distance. He knew it was very important now not to show any weakness. Wolves were incredibly sensitive to any sign of vulnerability. They would never attempt to attack a large bull like him unless he was injured, and injured he was. They approached cautiously, getting ready to turn and run at the sight of a charge. He did not charge, he could not, and they did not run, but they moved increasingly towards him. He got to his feet and pain shot through his upper right leg. It was agony, and he hoped that his long hair would mask any wound which might be present. Fortunately, whatever had struck him had not torn the skin, or the smell and sight of the blood would reveal the truth of the situation to the wolves. The wolves were clever though. They knew that something was up. It was not normal for a bull to stay so far away from the herd. One of them walked briskly towards him, wagging its tail, but then it backed away when he lowered his head towards it. Another wolf circled behind him, and he managed to stomp with his left leg, which sent pain coursing through his right leg as it supported his weight for a brief second. Still, it did the trick, and the wolves backed away. They lay down to rest. It was already getting dark, and they were in no rush. This situation was far too interesting for them to leave the scene now. It was turning out to be the longest night of his life. He had 8 hungry eyes fixed on his weakening body. A constant thunder of dull pain rumbled through his leg, occasionally snapping into lightning every time he moved it. He did not know how long he could last like this. He tried to stay awake, and it seemed each time he closed his eyes and reopened them with a start, one of the 4 wolves had crept a little closer to him. The rest of the herd had not seen the mean old bull muskox as he charged into the dominant male. They had only seen him as he shortly appeared afterwards, running towards them at great speed, suggesting that the wolves were still in pursuit, and they had continued to run to the far side of the hill together, where they continued to move the calves quickly away from those dangerous predators. The old bull began to reorganize the dominance hierarchy of the group with threatening gestures to the subordinate males. The whole group had been shaken by the wolf encounter and the loss of the strongest member of their group. In desperation for more peaceful times, they did not counter the mean old bull's antagonizing gestures. His plan had worked perfectly. He was now at the top of a new herd of muskoxen. He had dominance over the subordinates and mating rights to the females. He continued to march the herd away from the wolf scene, though he knew that the wolves would be busy with the body of the leader that he had knocked down. Weeks went by, and the herd did not hear any more from the wolves. Patches of snow had started to melt, and the muskoxen raced excitedly towards the first shoots of grass appearing in the white. The mean old bull took great pleasure in attacking the other animals when they came too close to his patches of grass. He had mated with the cows in the herd that did not have calves, and he needed energy from the grass to keep those treacherous other males away. They hated him, but there was something about his raggedy old appearance which made them afraid. He may not have been stronger than them, but he was certainly more experienced in combat. The females of the herd also resented him. Every time they had been approached by the younger and more attractive males of the herd, the old bull had attacked them and the male in question with unnecessary aggression. He was so territorial over feeding grounds. He spent more time chasing them away than he did eating himself, and the whole herd was suffering as a consequence. They should have been gaining much more fat in the new abundance of this fresh spring grass than they were. The winds had died down now as spring came. The sun painted fresh colour into the grey landscape with the new appearance of species of vegetation emerging out of the snow. The old male spotted an Arctic willow bush. This is a favourite of the muskoxen, and he greedily ran towards it after chasing the others away. When he got to it, he lowered his head to graze on the succulent stems, but then his blood froze. There was a preorbital gland message here.
Which of our kind can just leave one behind?
It can't be, he thought. I left you as wolf meat. He took a few steps back nervously. His whole body was shaking now. He looked around for the bull, but the bull was nowhere to be seen. He could, however, smell that these markings were fresh. He turned to move the herd away from the area, but then saw the whole herd looking in his direction. One of the subordinate males, the stocky one with the light patch of fur above his left eye, read out another message that he had smelt on one of the nearby rocks.
You struck me down for the wolves we found.
The herd looked at the old bull angrily, and he cowered backwards away from them.
A betrayal of this sort deserves to be caught,
spoke one of the females, who had found another message in the grass.
Turn here your sight and prepare to fight,
spoke her calf, who had found another message. The old bull looked around nervously, not knowing whether to fear vengeance from the herd or seek out this ghostly apparition which was speaking to him from the dead. He eventually turned, and there, standing hunched over a limp foreleg, was our dominant male. He was in bad condition. He was terribly thin and missing clumps of hair around his neck. He had deep wounds on his face. This time I'm going to kill you myself, thought the mean old bull, and he charged at the weakened male with his head held low. He knew that he had the advantage, and would finish the job once and for all. He looked at his opponent while charging, and saw no fear in his eyes, but more of an acceptance of a fate which has yet come to pass. The mean old male was about to end his charge with a high-velocity collision when he was struck hard in the midsection by a sideward attack from one of the young males. It was the one with the patch of light fur above his left eye. The old bull went rolling into the snow and lay there with broken ribs, stunned, unable to stand. Our dominant male limped forwards towards the herd again, and they greeted him excitedly, each spending a few moments with their noses touching. As he approached the dominant female with whom he'd fathered a calf, he was warned off by the young male who had just saved him from the mean old bull. Our dominant male was too weak now to remain in his previous high-ranking position, but he and the young bull had a mutual respect for each other, and he graciously accepted his new position. He was content to be back, and they set off on their way to enjoy the beginning of the spring and fresh grass that it brings. The mean old bull lay in the snow, drifting in and out of consciousness on the freezing cold ground. He was dizzy and confused. He did not know how long it had been, but he had started hallucinating. It looked like 4 large snowballs had been rolling towards him down the hill. Every time he opened his eyes, they had rolled a little bit closer and grown a little bit larger. The final time he opened his eyes, he saw one of the snowballs wagging its tail. Strength and might can help win the fight, but loyalty knows no bounds. In the cold black heart of a winter's night, betrayal will just feed the hounds.